Good afternoon, or good evening, or good morning, whenever you're listening to this, and welcome to another episode of the Syndicate podcast with myself, Shane Story, my co-host Lawrence King, who is currently chowing down on
I'm here.
some very high performance like nutrition, which is a topic we're going to be discussing. We're going to be discussing with Brian O'Hangasa. So Brian O'Hangasa is a coach, a nutrition coach with Triage Method. He is also my coach, and he is a very intelligent man. So we have him on today to discuss performance nutrition. So Brian, would you like to introduce yourself to the people?
Yeah, sure thing, Shane. Sound for that, man. As you said, I am a nutritionist and the head nutrition coach within Triage Method, which everyone should be familiar with if they're listening to this podcast, right? So yeah, that's what we do. I don't need to go into too much detail with that, but yeah, no, I went to college, studied nutrition there. Following on from that, did some nutrition coaching courses as well, so the likes of precision nutrition, and that is, essentially how I got down this path. I always knew I wanted to kind of coach people. Well, I won't say always, but like after a certain point, I knew I wanted to coach people on kind of a one-to-one basis, and help them with their nutrition and health habits and performance, and whatever else they need from their nutritionist. So yeah, I don't need to go on too much longer on an intro.
It's pretty sweet. So I suppose today we're mainly going to be touching on like how you can improve your nutrition to improve like your kind of powerlifting gains, your hypertrophy gains. So with that, I suppose it's always a good starting place to talk about like what is the most important things that we need to focus on when it comes to improving performance on those sides. So Brian, like if you were to come up with some kind of hierarchy of what would be the most important things that somebody needs to focus on, like what would that kind of look like?
Yeah, absolutely. So, it's going to be pretty simple, right? But a lot of people miss out on the simple stuff quite often, and they're shooting for the more glamorous, shiny thing that isn't going to have as much bang for your buck as the hierarchy, which we can go into now, which is, first of all, you're going to have total energy intake or total calorie intake, right? That is not where it needs to be. I can give some guidelines on how to assess that, but if that's not where it needs to be, you're not going to have that energy to train hard and recover and create those adaptations that you're looking for from powerlifting, or if you're training for hypertrophy, which is going to support your powerlifting. It's just not going to happen. If you're there, say your calorie requirements were 3,000 a day, and if you're there eating 2,000 calories a day, like you're going to leave a lot on the table, like literally and figuratively, because of the food you're not eating. But that's not going to support maximal strength and performance. So after that, you have to look at, say, protein intake, right? Because in the process of lifting weights and shifting tin, you are breaking down muscle fibers. You need amino acids that are going to come from dietary protein to repair those. If you don't have those, you're just not going to adapt again to the training, right? You're not going to come back bigger, you're not going to come back stronger if you don't have those nutrients on board. And then after that, we would say that carbohydrate intake is quite important. I suppose depending what phase someone's in, you could argue it maybe differs a little bit, but predominantly most people engaged in powerlifting, strength sports, sports where being big and strong is the priority, they're going to benefit from fueling their training sessions using carbohydrates. Okay, they're going to be the main energy source for those training sessions, like except for maybe something like a peak week where volume is quite low. But generally, like the bulk of all your training is going to be very much carbohydrate and glycogen, glucose dependent. Okay, so you do want to make sure that your carbohydrate intake is where it needs to be. And we can talk about how to actually set this up if you like, because I know it annoys me when I listen to podcasts and people just kind of dance around topics and don't give people actionable take-home points. That really bugs me. like I'm just giving an overview here, and then we can go into it in a bit more detail. But after that, I would say then I suppose nutrient timing and kind of meal timing does play a role, depending what you're trying to do. Like this is kind of goal dependent. So if we're talking about getting as big and strong as possible, right, without, like, say the focus essentially is not fat loss, right? That's what I'm getting at. Then I think meal timing becomes reasonably important for these kind of sports. And I mean, hydration is massive as well, you know, so you'd probably put that up a few rungs, but you know, that technically is nutrition, but kind of talk about it aside from, say, the calorie and macronutrient standpoint. And then you can bring supplementation into it, of course. You know, people want to say, like, you know, supplements are just the cherry on the top or the icing on the cake, right? Because I suppose people who know what they're talking about, they want to discourage people from just going straight to supplements, right? Because that's the shiny magic thing that's going to solve all your strength and performance problems. And if you just do that and ignore everything else I said, then you're fine, which is not going to be the case. However, I'm not of the opinion that you need to wait until all that stuff is in line before you can start using supplements that might actually support your performance. You need to get all that other shit in order, but you know, I wouldn't say, you know, wait. I don't want to say like, oh no, you have to wait till your calorie intake is appropriate and your protein intake is appropriate before you can start taking creatine. I think that's a bit stupid. Like, why would you delay? And the same goes for any kind of nutritional support to kind of correct deficiencies, right, which will indirectly and directly, you know, help your performance. So yeah, that's the layout. All right. So if we want to discuss any of those points or go into a bit more, let me know.
Yeah, I definitely think the supplement thing is definitely something that it's an easy thing that you can knock out pretty instantly. Like, you know, all you have to do is buy the supplements and then take them, whereas the rest kind of involves a lot more behavior change. Like, even if somebody does have a kind of hardline goal of like increasing their performance, you still do have to tackle with that kind of barrier of behavior change. I suppose, as something I put up on my Instagram story earlier, of like, you know, people who respond to do as I say coaching, and people who want to be, some people who need a bit more kind of collaborative effort with them. Like, you know, typically maybe those people need a bit more kind of time before they're going to, like, you know, nail their protein intake or nail their calories consistently. Whereas like the other people, obviously they'll have probably no issue with it, but they might never really kind of look into how they can kind of do those maybe behaviors without a coach.
Yeah. Just so people are aware as well, Shane's adherence is absolutely excellent. Right. So I can vouch for that as his coach, that he practices really, what he preaches and more, I would say. So just so we all know about that, right?
Yeah, I think Connor and Ian are going to be delighted to hear that you're really adherent. We clarified last week, Brian, that we've two mainstays.
Yeah.
So we have to address them and everyone. But so kind of going back to what you were saying there, that there is something kind of you want to give kind of actionable advice to people kind of coming off this. Let's just maybe start at the bottom of the hierarchy there that you laid out for us. So we're kind of talking energy expenditure and kind of total caloric need. So where do people start with that?
Yeah, perfect. So give people like kind of rough guidelines. You know, there's only so specific I can be talking generally to, you know, whoever's listening to the podcast. But as a good place to start, and then, you know, you would make adjustments as you go on once you have this starting point. But it depends on, so I'll give three options, right? So some people in the sport might be looking to lose body fat, right, to improve their body composition. If they need to make weight, you know, aside from kind of week leading up to the competition practices, you know, they need to get leaner, right, just be in a better position to compete in the sport, right? So say fat loss calories, we'd set them at between 20 and 25 calories per kilogram of body weight, right? That's a decent place to start. Like, you know, it's a reasonably wide range. So again, you need to kind of start somewhere, give it a couple of weeks, see, are you getting the results that you want from that? You know, if it's fat loss, then obviously, you know, you should be getting leaner, and you know, weight's generally going to be coming down, right? So 20-25 calories per kilo if the goal is fat loss, if the goal is maintenance, right, which is probably where a lot of athletes in the sport are going to be spending time, right? So their weight shouldn't be fluctuating too much, but they're definitely progressing their training along as much as possible. That's going to be about 25 to 30 calories per kilogram. Okay. And then if someone's actually in a gaining phase, potentially doing more hypertrophy based training, then we can put that at about 30, 35 calories per kilo of body weight, right? That's a nice place for people to start. As I said, that's not going to perfectly apply to every single person that does powerlifting, right? So you're listening to this and you're like, hey, no, that's not right for me. It's like, all right, yeah, it's probably not, but it's a good starting point for people who've maybe not looked at this too in depth, right? It's a nice kind of easy number. It's like, all right, I'm going to take that, set those calories up, and then take it from there. Because like I said, if you're trying to get bigger and stronger and you're not having enough calories going in, and obviously there's like within reason, because I think in the sport as well, people use that as an excuse to like just overdo it, right? Like, I'm bulking, so I'm gonna eat like an asshole just 7 days a week, or I trained. I did a big lower body session today, therefore I need to eat like 3 times as much as I do on a normal day. That's probably not right, but we also want to make sure people aren't under fueling for the sport. So you can usually tracking trends in your strength, tracking trends in your body weight will give you a good idea of where the calories that you're eating are. And you don't necessarily have to track the calories either, but you should have some sort of structure to your meals where it's like, okay, if I'm training away and I'm not making the gains that I want, or like I'm losing weight and I'm not intending to lose weight, and you assess your kind of daily intake and you're like, oh, I'm only having 2 meals a day. Okay, well, let's maybe add a 3rd meal in there, right? That might resolve that for you. But you need to take stock of some sort, like where you're currently at, how that's going for you, and then make adjustments from there. Like, so adding more food or reducing your food intake, whatever the case may be. And then look, if you are tracking, even if you only do it for like a week or two, that can be quite informative. Not that you have to do it long term. But that's where I would set someone's calories, like roughly speaking. It'd be a bit more precise potentially if, me or Shane are working with someone individually one-to-one, like we'll have more information. But that's a good, I think, starting point for people.
Yeah, that definitely sounds quite pragmatic as well, that nobody needs to have a higher nutrition coach even just to figure that out. It's as basic as, are you gaining weight? Are you losing weight? Are you feeling tired coming into the gym? All of these kind of factors could contribute. So from there, we'll kind of come one rung up the pyramid, I suppose. So from there, I'd imagine people would maybe want to work out their macronutrient breakdown. So I suppose what would be your next piece of advice maybe for your average gym bro or gym guy?
Yeah. So to continue making this pragmatic, so people actually can utilize this when they listen to it. Protein intake is going to be first, and that's going to be super important, like I said, for actually supporting the adaptations to the training that you're doing. Because if you're training and you're not recovering, you're not getting anywhere really. It's just not going to be the case. So you need to make sure there are enough amino acids coming in. Like I said, where do you get those? From dietary protein sources. I don't need to explain what those are. I don't think people can Google that if they need to. But I would guess most people have a decent idea of what that is. But what I say?
Potentially. Be surprised.
Okay. But in terms of protein intake, again, we look at this, say per body weight first, or per kilo body weight, first of all, to be more precise. So somewhere between 1.6 and 2.5 grams of protein per kilo of body weight is a good place to be in. Now, the higher end of that will generally support more muscle gain or more muscle retention if somebody is in a fat loss phase. So generally the rule is like you can work, if you're going to be at the higher end of that range, you're in a fat loss phase. You maybe find you don't recover as well on lower protein intakes. Maybe find your appetite is too high on lower protein intakes. They're all criteria for, say, moving up towards the higher end. And I would advise people to experiment with this. Like, okay, if I'm doing 2 grams per kilo at the moment, and I have a fair amount of calories to play with, maybe I'll go up like a bit higher, right? But for the lower end of the range, and some of this comes down to personal preference as well, and it's like, how well am I recovering? Is my strength progressing like I wanted to? And all that stuff. Like, you need to take some of that kind of subjective feedback and objective feedback as well. But about 1.6 grams per kilo would be more appropriate for somebody who is in a gaining phase, right? So there's a surplus of energy available, right? So muscle loss is not really a worry or a concern, because you're eating enough calories, right? So your body's like, Grant, we've lots of energy coming in. So yeah, you could potentially, if you're in like a decent surplus, you could potentially get away with 1.6 grams per kilo. But I would typically have most people in around 2, right? I think that's a good middling point, and maybe towards the higher end. But again, like, if someone maybe doesn't have that many calories to play with, and like they're going super high on the protein end, and it means like they have fuck all carbs to be eaten, then maybe that's a basis for reducing the protein a little bit so they can have more carbs. Makes the diet more enjoyable, more practical, as well as, you know, having carbs in there to support your training performance, right? Which is important. And I suppose we'll get onto that now in a sec.
Yeah, I think definitely, I suppose the practicalities of the higher protein intakes have to be factored in first, because I like, first of all, I know if I was put on a lower protein intake, if you had me on 1.6, I'd struggle to say within that. Like, I think 2.2 plus like is easy for me to hit, like it's no problem, whereas lower intakes would be a struggle. Whereas like, I know from like a lot of clients that I would have worked with in the past, like even getting them up to that 1.6 would be quite an effort, you know. But I suppose it would be a huge generalization for me to say that probably in powerlifting circles, people don't have too much of an issue getting up towards 1.6. Probably a lot more kind of meat eaters, it tends to be a good stereotype, I suppose. But like, they're obviously going to have they're going to have way less of an issue getting up towards that kind of higher end. Typically when people are looking to reduce the overall amount of kind of animal products in the diet, that they do kind of need a bit more kind of adjustments in the diet to get there.
Yeah. And actually, just before I forget, again, maybe you're not tracking your protein intake. Again, it could be very useful for you to do it just for a couple of weeks. You don't even have to use like a tracking app or anything, but like, if you just kind of take stock of your food labels a little bit, and there's kind of rules of thumb when it comes to protein intake, that like, you know, raw animal protein, so like any meat, fish, or poultry, is generally about 20% protein. So, you know, 20 grams per 100 grams of that stuff raw. So like, you know, that's a good sort of guideline. But you would be looking to say just get like 1 to 2 servings of protein per meal, right? Is, you know, you shouldn't really have meals that are without protein. It's generally like it's going to be harder to hit your targets if that is the case. So like, again, what counts as a serving is going to vary from person to person. We can use like the kind of hand portion guidelines, where you know, like a palm sized amount of like a meat, fish, poultry is 1 serving. You know, most men are going to want to have, you know, 2 servings per meal. Women probably 1 to 2 servings per meal. That's probably going to equate to like 20 to 30 grams of protein per serving, depending on the source. I don't want to get too bogged down in the details, but like kind of fattier protein sources will be on the lower end of that. Like, so, you know, oily fish like salmon, and then like the lean kind of poultry and white fish and stuff will be at the higher end, right? So I don't need to go into more detail than that, but just you know, so people have an idea of like, okay, what should this look like if, you know, I'm not tracking my protein intake. I think you should be able to get a decent tally on it. You know, just looking at like general, like just looking at labels of the food, should give you a good idea. You know, and like I said, there are those rules of thumb. So any high protein yogurts, which would be 8 grams of protein per 100 grams or better, as I've just said, there are about 8 grams of protein per 100 grams. So, you know, if you have 200 grams of that, it's like, all right, that's close to 20 grams of protein. Pint of milk, close to that amount. An egg is a large egg is about 7 grams of protein. So there's a few little rules of thumbs there for like the kind of main protein sources. A scoop of protein powder is like 20 to 25 grams, depending on the source. So even just going by that, you should be able to get a rough idea. And then you'll get a little bit of like supplementary protein coming from probably plant sources like, grains, pastas and rice and oats and stuff. If you're eating like beans and lentils and chickpeas and that, you're going to get some there as well.
Yeah, and if anybody is really struggling to think of any sources, if you go to my Instagram page, sstory94, I do have like a post of like 20 or so high protein foods and the amount of protein per 100 gram per serving. So it's probably about 6 or 7 or 10 posts down. So you can go there. I suppose the next topic then is.
I actually had I suppose.
Oh, go on, Lawrence.
I suppose there's just your I suppose I'm kind of thinking back to the conversation we had there before we started, Brian, just when we were both maybe 16, 17, sitting in the back of biology or French or whatever, eating our bags of chicken or our boxes of chicken, broccoli and rice. So I suppose that maybe you want to answer this now, maybe it comes later, but like, what are some kind of things when you do have clients and they're setting up their protein requirements, some kind of common errors that you've seen? Because I suppose we are giving guidelines and stuff like that, but maybe for people, they might be unaware of maybe some mistakes they were doing, or maybe a better way of approaching it. So what kind of mistakes have you seen just as regards that?
Probably the main mistake that you see with people is that their breakfast is very low in protein. So kind of like a typical protein distribution across the day tends to be very skewed. So a typical person's day, not like us in biology or well, Spanish in my case, but other people, they probably have quite a low protein breakfast. Like, so say if somebody's have like oats and like blueberries or something for breakfast, right? There's very little protein in that. It's a good breakfast, but there's very little protein in it. Then they might have, a low protein snack of some sort. Maybe they have a yogurt or something as a snack and some fruit. Again, not a bad idea, but a lot of yogurts are not high in protein. So that's why I said look for the ones that are about 8 grams per 100 grams or more. Just check the label. And they might have lunch, so that could be like a sandwich and a bag of crisps and chocolate bar or whatever. Again, there's only so much protein you can fit into a sandwich, right? It's probably not going to be enough.
You've been eating the wrong sandwiches, I don't know.
Maybe you'll have to share with me your sandwich hacks.
Yeah.
And then they might have dinner, right? Which for most people will have a decent source of protein, but then again, it easily could not. Like if they have maybe like a pasta bake or something, again, there's going to be really none to speak of in that. Maybe a little bit from the cheese and the pasta. So just having like awareness of what protein sources are, and then saying, yes, I'm going to have one of those at every meal. And like protein at breakfast is one of the kind of first habits I'd work on with a lot of people, because that's what's missing. So that's what that answers your question. And then again at lunch, when I'm coaching people, it's like, I don't want you to go from having oats and blueberries for breakfast to having like salmon and kale for breakfast, right? I don't want that to be the first thing that we try and do. So I just want to enhance what you're currently doing to make it more in line with your goals. So if you're currently having, a sandwich and like some fruit and crisps or whatever for lunch, then fine, we'll just add in a high protein yogurt there, or we'll add in a protein milk or a shake even, or maybe instead of a chocolate bar, you have a protein bar, and that helps, right? And we'll just build it from there, and eventually get you to a point where, the boxes are ticked at every meal essentially.
Excellent. So I suppose from there, we've kind of covered protein as regards your, as a constituent of your caloric needs. So from there, I suppose we come to lovely carbohydrates. So where do people go from there?
So we've set your, calorie intake, we've set your protein intake. Those are definitely the two most important, right? They'll cover a disproportionate amount compared to the rest of what we'll talk about. Now, usually when you're setting up someone's calories, you go with the fat intake next, right? And then whatever's left goes to carbohydrates. Carb intake can vary quite a bit. like depending on what someone's needs and goals are. But for strength and power athletes, you're going to usually see like between 3 and 5 grams per kilo of carbohydrates. Again, that's very dependent on what are they trying to do at this moment in time. Like if someone's in a fat loss phase, their carbs might go lower, relatively speaking, than when they're just absolutely just going for performance and trying to max that out. You also have to see what's left within your calories as well, right? But we do usually set fat first, after protein, based on what calories are left. So that's usually between 0.8 and like maybe 1.5 grams per kilo body weight. So it's quite a wide range. Generally, for this type of sport, moderate fat, I would say, is preferable to going high. So then you have more room to have more carbs. And then whatever's left in your calories, you're going to put towards carbohydrates. And hopefully this will all match up and it'll be in that maybe 3 to 5 grams per kilo range. What was I going to say there? Yeah, sorry, I meant to say that, like, just so people know as well, in case they don't know, it's like protein is 4 calories per gram, and fat is 9 calories per gram, and carbs are 4 calories per gram. So if you have that total calorie number that I've given you, and then you've said, okay, my protein intake is this many grams, you have to multiply that by 4 and subtract it from the calories, and do the same with fat as well. And then you'll have a calorie target left for carbs, and then you divide that by 4, and then that'll take the grams, right? That sounds super confusing as I've just rattled it off there, but it's not, right? It'll be okay. If anyone's struggling with that, they can message me and I'll help them, right? And then, if the fat intake will kind of depend on personal preference. What kind of foods does the person like to eat? You don't need a huge amount of dietary fat, like for health purposes. So you can bias quite a lot towards carbohydrates. However, having a moderate amount, at least, of all the macronutrients makes life a bit easier, because like if you go super low fat, it's kind of hard to stick to that. As a reference point, like for health reasons, you wouldn't go below like 30 grams a day for any sort of long period of time. There shouldn't be anyone listening to this is going to be kind of verging on that. And then, healthy fat sources are predominantly plant-based, so nuts, seeds, avocados, and then also oily fish. They're kind of olive products, like they're kind of the best sources when it comes to fats. The omega-3s that you get in oily fish are the most important of all. So, the less fat someone's eating, the more particular they have to be about their sources, I suppose, to make sure they're getting the actual key nutrients. That's where omega-3 fats come into it, especially from those marine sources. But yeah, again, back to carbohydrates, if you're not tracking this stuff, essentially, like, again, probably don't want to go too many meals in the day without 1 or 2 servings of carbs. Again, depending what your goals are. If you have fat loss goals, that might happen occasionally. But for like maintenance and muscle gain, then no, you're going to most likely be having carbs with most meals, ideally. Again, there's a lot of leeway with this, and you can definitely plan it. Like if someone just wants to have a high protein, high fat breakfast and doesn't want to have a lot of carbs, then that can be figured out. But I'm having to speak, reasonably generally here.
One thing I was going to actually ask you around the carbohydrates. So, like we're going to touch on nutrient time in a second, but I suppose this kind of be a segue into it. One thing you will see in powerlifting quite often is, like, people will be consuming carbohydrates during the training session, but it's not necessarily always kind of quick digestion carbohydrates. So could you touch a little bit on kind of what would be the best type of like intra-session carbohydrate to take in, and then like what can you do in regards to timing for that too?
Yeah, so when it comes to adding carbohydrates intra-workout, usually the rule for that is, like, if your session doesn't go much beyond an hour, you probably don't need to be consuming carbohydrates within that session. Not to say that they won't help, but it also depends on, like, again, your goals. So like if you have a huge carbohydrate target to hit, then yeah, having some, say, liquid carbohydrates or fast digesting carbohydrates within a session makes it very, very easy. It's like, you know, you lob in a few handfuls of jellies and, you know, that's, you know, 100 grams of carbs gone, right? Lawrence is laughing here for some reason. I'm sure
it's just the old meme of like powerlifters eating fucking ham sandwiches halfway through a training session. In the powerlifting club at home, like you genuinely had like lads like giving you their wisdom when you were 16 or 17, genuinely telling you that they ate ham sandwiches. So
yeah, I mean, like my girlfriend trains in abs in Cork, and yeah, like she's always saying how there's like people making cups of tea and shit and eating Milky Bars and probably ham sandwiches. Oh yeah, they're definitely getting like, what's that pita chicken place, KC's or something, is it?
Oh yeah, that'd be all right actually. Yeah, you know how good your training session. Yeah.
But yeah, like if we're talking what's optimal, you know, what's optimal is going to be fast digesting carbohydrates, so essentially sugars, right? So that's going to maybe come from something like a sports drink, like a Lucozade Sport, coconut water, jellies work fine. You can use carb powders, where certain carb powders tend to be very well digested, so the likes of you know, highly branched cyclic dextrin, cluster dextrin, Vitargo, right? They're very nice on the digestion. That like a lot of powerlifters have iron stomachs anyway, so it's probably not that relevant, but you know, those are nice sources to consume intra workout. You can also use dextrose, you know, that works just as well, or maltodextrin, and they're all like, you know, powders you mix into liquid and then consume them. But yeah, generally the rule is like you consume like, depending on the sport, but like say for powerlifting, realistically it's going to be say between 30 and 50 grams maybe of carbs per hour after the first hour. So if you're training for an hour, no intra workout carbs are needed, like to support optimal performance. Again, it's not to say that it can't have utility if you have, you know, 600, 700 grams of carbs to hit, and, you know, having 30 grams from a Lucozade Sport is going to help you do that. That's fine. But I'm just saying, like, what's actually trying to optimize performance. But once you get, you know, say to that 90-minute mark, up to the 2-hour mark, you probably want to consume about 30 to 50 grams within that. And then, you know, if you stretch on to 3 hours, you're probably going to get another bit in there as well. Like that's typically the longest the session might be, right? About 3 hours. Yeah.
With maybe about 30 minutes of actual work completed. But yeah, I suppose that's another thing to kind of consider, isn't it? Like, I suppose a lot of the intra kind of workout carb recommendations come from like endurance training, not so much powerlifting. Like the amount of, you do more rests in the powerlifting session than you do work. So you also have to think about, would it be better if I had the carbohydrates at another time throughout the day in a meal, like, as opposed to, like, I think in my opinion, it really has a good utility to have carbohydrates in the session if you have a very high carbohydrate intake.
Yeah,
you're having like 300, even 400 grams of carbohydrates a day. Like, it's not terribly high carb. Like, you could probably do with having those carbohydrates at meals.
Yeah, because you have to factor in that the liquid and intra workout carbs do absolutely nothing for your satiety, right? So they're not going to do anything for keeping you full. So if someone blows a huge amount of their carbs pre, during, and post workout, and they're fucking starving like other parts of the day as a result, that's not smart nutrition programming.
Yeah, and then because they're trying to have the quick digestion carbohydrates pre, during, and post, they get like no fiber intra today as well.
Yeah, that's another important consideration.
So I suppose that's pretty much carbohydrate timing down. Obviously, one of the most important ones is clearly protein timing, because, you know, you have to have your shake 30 minutes after your workout. I actually did that before. Well, obviously I did that before, but one time I went nuts at my mom for not picking me up from the gym at time. She picked me up like an hour late, and I was absolutely fuming. I didn't talk the entire way home. I was like, "What's wrong with you?" It's like, that workout.
The window's shut, Mom.
Yeah, like, it only happened last year, but I'll still think about it.
The worst 26th day ever.
Oh my god. Yeah, I mean, I suppose. Yeah, sorry, go on.
Kieran, like, just anecdotally from gym goers, powerlifters, bodybuilders, like the whole, like, people can be acutely aware of their protein needs. Like, they'll tell you, like, oh yeah, you know, I've worked out now and I know exactly how much protein I need to be hitting. And you turn around, you're like, oh yeah, yeah. Do you know, you could be working with someone or you're hanging out with someone and you realize, like, they could be eating 250 grams of protein split between 2 meals at about 9 hours apart or something. Like, I think the protein timing one might be an important one for you to talk about, maybe just to nail
Yeah.
it.
Yeah. So again, like, we're going down the hierarchy. So we've come to timing now after discussing quite a lot of other things. So that is representative, right? So timing is kind of crap to be spending too much time on, unless you've got those other things in order, right? But when you do have, like, you know, total calorie intake, total protein intake, total carb intake in order, and you look, the lines are kind of blurred as to, like, what's the exact order that this stuff runs in, like, in terms of the hierarchy. So, you know, you don't have to take what I say as complete gospel. Like, pretty much, yeah, calories and protein, yeah, they're, as I said, but then after that it can get a bit, you could chop and change some stuff. But we're talking about, say, nutrient timing and protein timing in particular. Like, what's optimal is certainly at least 3 to 4 feedings of protein per day. You know, those feedings are going to contain, depending on your requirements, like between 30 and 40 grams of protein, right? That's going to maximally stimulate muscle protein synthesis, right? Which is going to be good for getting bigger and stronger and recovering. Now, that's not to say that if you don't adhere to those criteria, that just you're not making any progress. Obviously not. But if we're talking about what's optimal here, and that's pretty practical as well. Like, I think it's pretty practical for people to have, you know, 3 to 4 meals that all have a reasonable amount of protein in them, right? So that's, it's optimal, but it's also a pretty easy one to tick off. And that way you're going to maximize your recovery and, you know, adaptations to the actual training that you're doing. So, you know, some of this comes down to what's practical for people. Like, for myself, you know, I'm at the tail end of a diet right now, so I'm not too concerned about timing of nutrients. I just want to make sure that I'm hitting enough protein per day and that I'm in a deficit at the end of the day. They're my main concern, and fiber intake is good. Like, so they're my main concern. So I'm not, like, I'm having like 2 very big meals a day and then another, probably a snack that's probably high in protein as well. So that might just about meet the 3 feedings criteria, but I'm not too concerned about it. But if you are trying to optimize things, this is what you should look at. And yeah, generally, like, for strength and power sports, like, you're probably going to do pretty well by having fairly evenly spaced meals across the day. You're probably going to do pretty well if you know, if it's practical for you to do so, having a pre-workout meal, you know, 1 to 4 hours beforehand, you know, with some protein and carbohydrates. The further out it is, the bigger it can be, and then, you know, closer to the session, it'll probably be smaller, depending on how you want to feel in your session. Like, you know, some people like to feel pretty full going into the session, so, you know, they'll cater that to their needs. And then, yeah, the post workout meal as well. Like, you don't have to be rushing to get the shake in and, like, going nuts at your mom if that doesn't happen, like Shane does. You know, you can just have a mixed meal, with protein, with carbohydrates, probably with fats as well, and that's going to cover you, right? That would change a little bit in the context of, like, training twice a day, but I don't think anybody is going to be training twice a day really in this context, are they?
Unlikely.
Yeah, and not, at least not two, like, strength related sessions. Like, they might be doing cardio and strength training maybe. Yeah, but probably not even the cardio, right?
Yeah, but, like, I mean, sets of 8 are pretty much enough. Like, you know.
Yeah, unless you're Shane and you're back in Spain and you want to put up some topless stories and topless Q&As, I think that's about as much.
Oh, won't be happening for a while.
So it sounds like you're talking distinctly here between optimal and then kind of what's efficient for the individual, in the sense that, like, while all these guidelines are fantastic and they are guidelines that are there for if you were to optimize everything, this is the route you would go. But then again, like you're saying, for you do realize that 3 meals is maybe on the cusp of being optimal, almost veering towards suboptimal. But for where your calories are right now, those 2 meals meet satiety needs, which allows you to be adherent. So I think largely for most people, it was like I was saying to you before we started the phone call, like it was just going around with a bag of chicken fillets probably and just eating them periodically throughout the day when I got hungry. Probably isn't optimal, but that's just the way I ate. Like some of my meals, like one of them could have been like 300 grams of cooked chicken fillets with like, I don't know, a bag of popcorn, and then maybe like 5 hours later it could have been 400 grams of chicken with, you know, whatever. Like, but it was just, that's what allowed me to remain adherent.
Yeah, it's like fish and a rice cake except chicken and popcorn.
Yeah, that was my life.
But I mean, look, like we could record. I know I could record a whole podcast and all the dumb shit I did when I was that age and before I knew better. And I'm sure you guys could fucking add in a lot. Like one time I mixed tuna with oats before, because I was like, that's class protein and that's class carbohydrates and that's how I'm gonna get jacked. I did it one time, never again.
You weren't wrong though, in fairness. Like, I know, I think the chicken in the bag was one of my worst ones. And then when I was dieting for, I think it was the first bodybuilding show I did, I was about 17 and I got the 3 weeks out, and I'm not exaggerating when I say this, lads. I like just the whole diet, I just decided I need to eat fish. I can't stomach, even though I can't stomach fish, and I couldn't eat fish at the time. So basically 2 weeks out from the show, I was probably eating 600 to 800 calories a day of just fish, and I was probably throwing up half of it as soon as I ate it.
One way to get shredded.
I do you know what? In fairness, like as far as methodologies go on the pursuit of shreds, like I mean, it's up there. Like, one thing I was definitely kind of eager to ask you about, because I suppose it's definitely one thing I've encountered with myself, and I suppose from a couple of people I've worked with or a couple of people I would have trained with, is kind of the prevalence of kind of disordered eating, or I won't say eating disorders, but at least kind of disordered eating among athletes, and I suppose maybe the necessity of it in some cases for attaining a level of leanness or a level of performance, or towards a specific goal.
Yeah, just to talk about that generally, is it?
Yeah, I don't know. I suppose it's just, I suppose you've worked with so many people, and it's an area you might be a bit more knowledgeable on than me.
Yeah. I mean, things like, say, bodybuilding and physique sports, they get a bad reputation for promoting disordered eating behaviors or eating disorders. I would also distinguish between those two. But at the same time, you have to think about who selectively ends up doing those kind of sports. People who probably already have a propensity for that sort of thing, and they can kind of mask it in the guise of, no, this is just dedication to my sport. So I suppose like some red flags and things, like inherently bodybuilding and physique sports, like they're not healthy for that chunk of the year where you're coming up to a show, right? And they're unhealthy and like kind of longer term, depending on, you know, what people are doing with it. You know, you see people in like kind of bulking phases just get their health markers just run away, and you know, a lot of that is accentuated by drug use. You know, for natural athletes, it's not going to be as big a deal, but you know, it's not inherently healthy. So like, you can't say that your habits and behaviors coming up to a show are going to be healthful, but that's okay because it's not a permanent thing. But then I suppose the mental side of that, like people not being prepared to not be their leanest ever all the time, you know, that kind of rebound, you wouldn't even have to call it a rebound. Like for some people it is a rebound, and you know, they gain drastic amounts of weight very quickly after a show, and they find that very tough mentally, and like, you know, their hormones are all fucked up afterwards as well. But yeah, it can be hard for people to say, like, it's hard for people, I suppose, not to look their best all the time once they've got to that point, even though it's so ridiculous when you say it out loud. It's like, well, obviously you can never look better than that, and well, if you're not looking better than that, you're probably looking worse, right? So that's just kind of something you have to accept. Kind of neuroticism about food selection and kind of adherence to the protocol, I think is hugely prevalent. And look, like the stuff that we're joking about there is definitely verging on that. Like, and that, I think that's just from like misinformation, not understanding what's actually important, which is why you're not hearing me say, all right, here's what you need to do, pal, right? So meal 1 is this, meal 2, 3, and 4 are these. And if you're not waking up at 3 a.m. to have another casein shake, like you're fucking yourself. Like, it's not, that's why you're not getting into that shit, because that shit isn't important. Like, that's why I'm trying to give people the principles here that they can stick to. And like, maybe the methods that they use will vary from person to person based on what's practical. Because yeah, that's, you said that a couple of minutes ago, Lawrence, that it sounds like I'm saying, like, you know, practicality comes before optimality. And it's like, that is something that I say all the time. Because I could give you the absolute best diet on the face of the earth right now, and if you can't stick to it, it has done you no good. So even if it's optimal, what fucking good is it if it's not practical in any sense? So yeah, I think a kind of misinformation about what's actually required. You know, it's like, I have to eat fish for these 2 weeks to thin my skin, bro. Like, that is obviously going to lead to kind of disordered beliefs around food. That, I suppose, the belief system that then leads to these disordered behaviors around food, being afraid of certain foods because, you know, 70% dark chocolate is healthy, but if it's 69%, then oh no, like that's a unhealthy food. It's going to make you fat.
Yeah.
So yeah, understanding the principles of like what is actually important, what boxes do you have to tick, and then giving people some free reign to like go about their business on that. Because like some of the advice is just ridiculous, unnecessarily so.
Yeah, I suppose definitely from someone that got into kind of strength physique sports quite young. I think looking back, like when you're definitely not aware of it, there are cultural norms within sports and almost like memes and archetypes that exist, like that they do exist for reasons, and people have been doing them as long as the sport has existed. So I think if I could sit down my 17 or 18-year-old self and kind of say to her, you know, kind of just be aware that your protein source probably doesn't make that of a difference. It doesn't make that much of a difference for eating every 2 hours. But I think, and it's kind of like, to, like you said, I suppose, provide people with principles and guidelines and give them the autonomy to actually make their own decisions rather than follow norms within the sport just because they're norms. And I suppose that'll exist within everything, but I think the potential for the norms within some sports can cause much more harm than others. I suppose that's kind of the crux of the matter.
Yeah, like to ask somebody, you know, why are we doing it this way, and the response to be, oh, it's because it's always been done this way, like, is one of the worst responses possible. You know, that should not be predicator for what we should continue to do, not without some like critical thinking. So me and Shane were talking about before you jumped on. Yeah, like give you an example. Like a friend of mine who is quite a successful natural bodybuilder, and he had a coach before that gave him a plan of like egg whites and almond butter as a meal. And it's like, well, why does that have to be fucking almond butter and not just whole eggs? Like, why are you making that distinction? Doesn't make any sense. And I remember Paddy talking about hiring a very prominent coach before, back when he was in college, and you know, it was like meal 3 or something was like white fish and egg whites or something, and it had to be consumed at like 3 o'clock. And he was like, well, I'm in a college lab at that time, like, so obviously I can adjust that. And it was like, no, you have to have it. It's like, well, I'm not whipping out fucking fish and egg whites in the middle of a lab, you know.
Dedicated, that's it.
Yeah, yeah. Well, don't blame me for the results you didn't get when you didn't do the work.
I don't know if you know Carl O'Sullivan, Dramatic Carl.
Oh yeah.
So he was telling us in one of the kind of webinars we do on a Thursday with Muscle Mentors. So one of his preps for peak week, his coach, who is apparently a very successful natural bodybuilding competitor, his peak week protocol was like to eat 26 bananas a day plus like about 2 kilos of potatoes. No explanation given. And he just did it. Didn't question it.
I think I've seen him talk about that before. Yeah.
Very funny.
Did he look good?
That's commitment.
I know, and that's the whole point, isn't it? Like, that's just giving someone a method that's probably not required, with no explanation given, and people are just trusted. Yeah.
Anyway, so that was pretty good. That was some really good, valuable, and practical stuff that I think the listeners can use going forward. So thanks very much for that, Brian. Is there anything else that you want to kind of add on to the end of the discussion?
Yeah. I think for the sake of being comprehensive, I'll spend a few minutes. I have a few minutes, so I'll spend a few minutes on hydration and supplementation. So just some quick take homes without going into too much detail, right? But if you're anyway dehydrated, your performance is going to suffer, right? Your muscles are mostly water. What's not water is protein. So if your muscles are dehydrated and your brain is dehydrated, you're not lifting well. So again, simple rule for estimating fluid requirements: about 40 mils of fluid per kilo of body weight per day. As Shane drinks some water as I'm saying that. Very nice. Subliminal messaging. But about 40 mils per kilo is usually pretty good for most people who are, somewhat active. You have to adjust that up and down again based on your own needs, your climate, that sort of stuff, how much you're actually sweating during training sessions. But that's a good one. And I would absolutely bias, having half a liter to a liter in the first hour upon waking, because you've been dehydrating all night essentially. And then the same again, probably pre and post training. But like, if you can not like tick those boxes and kind of timing your hydration, you'll probably hit like close to your hydration target anyway, but you're also hydrating optimally from a performance standpoint. So that's one thing. And then I suppose quickly run through some of the supplements that work for improving strength and performance. May not have time to describe and detail them all, but we're going to say caffeine, absolutely, right? Common mistake with caffeine is, taking it too late. However, powerlifting sessions very long. So even if you take it just before you start, you're probably still there, moving on to like bench or whatever, by the time that's starting to kick in. So just to be aware that the caffeine takes about 45, 60 minutes to peak in your bloodstream, especially if you're in a more fed state. So time it so that it kicks in based on that in your workout, right? So like if you're going in to do an hour session and you scull your pre-workout just before you go in, you're probably not getting the benefits of it in that actual session, right? So caffeine is one. Creatine is certainly a good one. That's one of the most, if not the most well-researched sports supplements. Not sure if that or whey protein comes first, but in terms of improving strength and power output, it's fantastic. Like anytime you're doing low rep work in there in your training sessions, it's mostly fueled by the creatine phosphate energy system, which, as the name suggests, creatine is very supportive of. So that's a fantastic supplement for everybody, right? Because it also has cognitive benefits and benefits to the brain. That are using creatine now in as a treatment for depression, right, in high doses. So creatine is super cool. You can take it even if you don't ever lift a weight in your life. The only caveat is like if your kidneys are impaired somehow, you should consult the doctor. And people worry about creatine and hair loss. That comes up a lot. Now, there's one study in that is not very convincing that creatine would actually contribute to that. There is another study ongoing at the moment that's been super delayed because of COVID and stuff, that's actually looking at this directly. So be very keen to see the results of that when they actually get around to. I don't even know if it's underway, but at least they're thinking about it, and we'll hopefully get underway, and then God knows when it'll get published. But anyway, so creatine, they're probably the two main ones. You could also look at citrulline malate, right, as a pre-workout option, and then as me and Shane have discussed before, like beta-alanine, I think has some utility as well, as a daily supplement, similar to creatine. So yeah, that's like, supplements in 4 minutes or whatever that was. So, and hydration.
Yeah, I don't think too many powerlifters will be worried about hair loss with creatine, considering most of them are old anyway.
Abusing antibiotics. Oh, he's fucking yellow in their head, but I think creatine and hair loss is way down the spectrum of worries. Yeah.
Sweet. Yeah, that was brilliant. Thanks for rounding it off like that. Yeah, I think definitely with the supplements, like you could make a whole podcast even just talking about like dosages and kind of mechanisms of all that kind of stuff as well. That's for another day. But yeah, thank you very much, Brian. If you want to tell the listeners where they can find you.
Yeah, sure thing. Thanks guys for having me on. Good to have the chat. Appreciate it. And yeah, if anyone wants to find out more about me or contact me, or we all put out good content here in Triage, but Brian O'Hangasa is my Instagram handle, which is, if you get BRIANOH, you'll probably find me at that point because it's a difficult name. But yeah, that's the best place to kind of follow me and what I'm doing. I'm not really active on other forms of social media. So that's the best one. And then obviously Triage Method on Instagram as well, and triagemethod.com to find out more about, what we do as coaches and, educational platforms and everything else. Yeah, that's where you should go.
Yeah, I definitely think anybody at all that's listening to this should definitely crack onto the Triage website. I think just as a resource for, regardless of if you're studying for a degree and you're looking for some help on a module, there's a lot of stuff on there that even for my undergrad I was kind of reading through, and even if you're just consolidating stuff you already know, or you might pick up a better explanation of something that you're studying. So I think people that aren't using that as a resource are definitely fucking themselves over. Brian, that was magic. Thanks so much.
So yeah, thank you very much for listening. If you like the podcast, you can share it on your social media. You can leave a review on iTunes. Do something that will help us out. Tell a friend. Whatever people do to use podcast engagement. But yeah, thank you very much. Hopefully we'll catch you in the next one. So yeah, peace out.